His storm. I promise, darling, you won't regret. The best years, I'll give you the best years. 5 seconds of summer. Trigger warnings. Angst and a grieving Harry. Though some of the residents in Grimmauld knew that there was more than a godfather-godson relationship between Harry and Sirius, most were oblivious, by that through simple-minded arrogance or the refusal to believe it. It was hard to see the way they hung off each other, relied on each other to do simple daily tasks. Sirius was Harry's whole world, and losing him to the Vale was not something he had planned on happening. He remembered Sirius in a way Sirius would want to be remembered. He remembered the way his leather jacket always hung on his frame and might have been just a little too big for him since his stay in Azkaban. He remembered the way his hair fell perfectly to his shoulders and smelt of rain and wind. He remembered the way Sirius talked, his lips moving to form every word, letting them out with perfect syllables. He remembered the way Sirius's touch felt, his hands pale, calloused and rough as they moved over his soft, delicate and tan skin. And most importantly, he remembered the way Sirius tasted like whiskey and Muggle cigarettes with a twinge of peach. Sirius was like a hurricane, strong, stormy, and on the brink of madness. And Harry was the eye, calm and collective, wrapped in the centre. Without a hurricane there could be no eye. To Harry, life was meaningless without his storm, without his other half. So he tried his best to be as close to Sirius as possible, hoarding fire whiskey and lighting cigarettes without the intent to use them, though occasionally his lips touched the bottle and he swirled a swallow around in his mouth, rejoicing in the burn as it went down, and only wore Sirius's clothes, absorbing his scent as if it were his own. He slept in Sirius's bed and used his shampoo if he took a shower, and shut everyone out. He hated the days it was just him and his thoughts, when he could remember too hard and felt his chest cave in just that much more. But he also hated the days people bothered him, asking if he was okay or bringing him food. He didn't want to eat, not without Sirius there to make it for him, even though the man could barely cook toast. Harry sighed, turning over onto his side, hugging Sirius's jacket close, shoving his nose into the fabric. He was past the stage of crying, though tears did occasionally leak from his eyes. He wasn't in control. He was living his life on autopilot, trying his best just to survive. Some days he wanted to forget, to have his memories taken away, but then he paused and shook his head. No, it just wouldn't do to forget the first time Sirius snuck him out to go stargazing. He'd learned so many constellations. Or the first time they kissed. Harry had been so nervous, his movements rapid and fearful of rejection. Or even their first fight. Sirius felt guilty. You're 15 for Christ's sakes. What would Jamie say? He loved Sirius and would do anything to get him back. He had been lucky, Hermione said. That Remus had held him, stopping him from running towards the Vale, though that wasn't how Harry saw it. He didn't see the point of being somewhere Sirius wasn't. He had been angry at Remus those first few weeks, though now he felt nothing except the growing despair at the mere thought of never hugging Sirius again. No more kisses or steamy touches after everyone had gone to bed. No more sneaking out with Padfoot to chase birds or simply run through the park feeling free. No more comfort, no more safety, no more Sirius. Sirius, Harry decided, was the reason he was still holding on. He would want Harry to live, and Harry wanted to live, because even in death He could feel Sirius glare on him every time he thought otherwise. Harry knew the Order was worried, though he couldn't bring himself to care. They were ignorant, saying things they didn't know weren't true. He was your godfather, Harry, and I know he isn't replaceable, but you barely knew him. Hell, you barely seen him in the 2 years since his breakout. Since his breakout, Ron had said, and Harry had thought about how that wasn't true. He thought about their meetings in 4th year. The start of their friendship had happened during the Triwizard Tournament. Sirius had helped him, believed him, when he said he didn't put his name in the cup. He had smuggled him books from the Black Library in an effort to sate his questions and give him a shoulder to cry on when Ron had left him. Sirius was his home, always dependable, something you've never without. But now he was. His Sirius was gone. He heard the floorboards creak outside Sirius's door, creak, and tensed for a moment, expecting Molly to bounce in berating him for spending so much time alone, or not eating, or not moving. But he relaxed as he heard Hermione's soft voice. "Harry?" she said, as she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Harry." He moved his eyes towards her and watched as she walked the rest of the distance to the bed, a tray of food in her hands. "I know this is hard for you," she said quietly, "and I know you loved him." Harry closed his eyes, burying his face deeper into his jacket. He tensed once again as he felt a hand on his back. "But I'm here for you. I'm here for you if you need to talk." She paused, her hand rubbing comforting circles on his clothed back. "I'm here for you if you need to talk about him, or yell, or fucking throw hexes." He snorted in shock. Hermione cursing? His snort seemed to be something, because Hermione's lips lifted into the barest of smiles. "You're a mess, you know," she snorted once again. Yeah, I have a right to be. I lost the love of my life." She mocked his voice, and he glared at her before sitting up straight, eyes wide. "Yes," Hermione whispered, her eyes cast down as if remembering something somber. "I know what it looks like to lose someone, because I lost mine too." Harry inhaled a shaky breath, clutching the jacket in his paler than usual hands, suddenly fighting himself not to burst into tears. Hermione looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "He was great, you know," she stated. "So kind and unbiased." She snorted, tears falling freely from her eyes. "He was like a ray of sunshine. Everywhere he went, people just seemed to be happier and more energetic." She paused, sniffling, and wiped her tears away. "I think he loved too much." Harry felt something wet on his cheek and raised his hand, wiping away the tears in surprise. "Who was he?" he asked, voice rough from a month of no use. Hermione grabbed his hands, and this time he didn't tense. "Cedric Diggory." She put her other hand to her mouth, as if to stop a sob. Harry pulled his hands away just as fast and scooted back as far as he could. "How can you stand to be near me?" he asked, horrified. Hermione looked confused for a moment, wiping her eyes furiously, and then her eyebrows raised in a form of shock. "No, Harry, no," she protested. "It was not your fault." She pointed at Harry admittedly, mentally asking him to understand. Harry sobbed, unable to stop it from coming out, bringing his hands up to clutch his chest. "It was Hermione. He choked. I I let him grab the cup. I brought him to that graveyard. Hermione grabbed him in her arms, hugging him tightly, and he wrapped his arms around her in an equal embrace, thankful as his sobs died down. No, Harry, she whispered gently into his ear, rocking them back and forth. It wasn't your fault. Cedric decided to go into that graveyard, or that he decided to stay, she said. She ran her hands through his messy, greasy hair and tried to comfort him just as she continued. Just like Sirius. And Harry tried to wiggle his way out of her arms to run away again. She grabbed him tighter, however, holding him in place. He travelled to the ministry of his own volition. He stayed even though a battle was imminent, because he loved you. She spoke, knowing that he wasn't only feeling guilty for Cedric's death. If it's anyone's fault Cedric is dead, it's Pettigrew's, she whispered, holding her tears in and trying to stay strong for Harry. And if anyone is to blame for Sirius's death, it's Bellatrix. By now, Harry was sobbing, both in relief and in thanks. He was so happy to have a friend like Hermione, someone he could count on all the time. Thank you, Harry choked out, clutching Hermione's Gryffindor sweater. You're welcome, Hermione said after a few seconds, and Harry hummed, burying his face in Hermione's shoulder and taking in her comforting scent of roses and raspberries. His eyes closed on their own accord. Hermione looked down when the sobs had died down to nothing more than sniffs, and saw that Harry was asleep. She smiled, noting that not only had she eased some of his guilt, but she had also gotten him to rest. She stood, careful of the food tray and Harry's head. She laid Harry down, pulling back the sheets and covering him, before kissing him on the forehead. She then turned and took the tray, which was layered with preservation charms, and set it on the bedside table. She approached the door and wiped her excess tears away before opening the door and heading downstairs. She was greeted with an anxious Remus. How is he? He said worriedly, eyebrows pulled together and a frown forming, setting on his face. Hermione sighed. He's guilty, which is to be expected. She paused, looking into the wolf's amber eyes. He's Harry after all. Remus nodded and pulled her into a hug once he noticed her puffy eyes. He'll get better, Remus said, his tone determined. Hermione nodded against his chest. I believe you, she said. He talked to me. Well, after I brought up the fact that I knew he loved Sirius and told him about Cedric. Remus pulled back, his hands on Hermione's shoulders. You told him about Cedric? He asked. How did he take it? Hermione sighed, looking down guiltily. He freaked out, asking me how I could stand to be around him. She looked back up at him, more tears in her eyes. He still believes it's his fault, she sobbed, shoving herself back into his arms and her face into Remus's chest. Remus seemed surprised for a moment before he brought his arms back around her. Shh, he tried to soothe her, running his hands through her bushy hair. He talked, though? She sobbed and nodded. He even fell asleep. Remus smiled. Thank you, Hermione, he said. Without you, Harry would still be awake at all hours of the night, wallowing in his own guilt. She smiled against his tear-soaked sweater. It's no problem, really. I'd do anything for Harry. Anything for Harry, Remus agreed. Harry awoke with a start as the flue downstairs activated loudly. He looked around, taking in his surroundings, and frowned at the food tray on his desk as he remembered yesterday's conversation. No matter what Hermione said, there was a small part of him that still felt guilty over both Cedric and Sirius's deaths. He sat, clutching the black jacket and staring at the tray, wondering if it was worth to eat when Sirius opened the door. "Albus has called an order meeting," he said. Harry didn't move, still staring at the warm bowl of soup on the tray. "He said it's important," Remus said, urging Harry out of bed. Harry sighed. What was one order meeting? He stood up, almost falling when his knees gave out. Remus grabbed his elbow, making sure he didn't fall, and Harry nodded his thanks. Remus frowned at how skinny Harry's arm was, but shook the thought out of his head, promising himself he'd make sure the boy ate later. He helped Harry down the many flight of stairs and led him into the kitchen, where he shoved a muffin into Harry's hands. Harry looked at the chocolate-baked good with disdain, and walked to the counter, which he leaned against, while picking at the cupcake liner wrapped around the muffin. Remus sighed and turned his attention to Hermione, who was sitting beside him looking at Harry in sadness as well. She turned to him. "You tried," she spoke, patting his arm softly. The rest of the order, minus Albus, Minerva, and Kingsley, sat around the table picking at the food presented to them. He sighed and turned his head back to the flue to wait for the rest of the order. Harry was grumpy. He was tired and hungry and sad and lonely. All of those things were things he hadn't felt in a long time, considering he hadn't felt much of anything at all, except for guilt really, in at least a month. He stared at the muffin with tired eyes and wished he could go lay back in Sirius's bed and that Albus would fucking hurry up already. He sighed in thanks as the flue roared one final time and he looked up, his dark circled covered eyes meeting the twinkling blue of the headmaster. "Hello all," he said cheerfully, addressing each of his order members. There were murmurs of hello, and of course a watcher from Dora. Albus continued on to some speech that Harry paid no attention to, continuing to play with his muffin liner, only to have his head shoot up automatically at the sound of Sirius's name. His eyes met Professor Dumbledore, and his brow twitched in annoyance at his ever-present twinkle. As we all know, the veil. Harry's hands tightened on his muffin, crushing it to crumbs, is used to transport away wardward spirits away from our plane and onto the astral plane. Dumbledore smiled, his eyes fluttering around to each member and every pair of eyes collected in the room. Therefore, when Sirius was shot with a stunning spell and consequently fell into the veil, Harry's hands clenched so hard his fingernails drew blood. The veil went into a state of repair, trying to find out why it was clogged, and as a result of these repairs, Dumbledore raised a ringer, looking around the room in suspense. "The veil has gifted us back what we have lost," he finished, waving his wand and tapping it on something that rested in the air. Harry almost fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness as the disillusionment spell faded away, revealing Sirius's perfect hair first, and then his godly face, and lastly his thinly muscled body. However, Harry's wand was fast to flee into his hands, and in disbelief, as he aimed it straight at this Sirius. The other order members gaped at Harry as the man raised his hand in the universal "I'm innocent" position. "Whoa, whoa, whoa! I thought you'd be more happy to see me, he said, walking closer, slowly. Harry held his wand firm, pressing it into the man's chest as he stepped within arm's reach. Harry, he whispered adoringly. Harry was shaking, tears falling freely, silently from his eyes. He sniffed. What did we do on August 28th, 1995? Harry asked, poking the man in the chest with his wand. When he refused to answer, just standing there gaping at him. The man swallowed. We snuck out. He paused, going to step closer, but Harry pushed him back. The answer wasn't enough. It was the third time. We stole a blanket and snuck out. He looked at Harry, physically in pain as he saw the state his young love was in. We watched the stars, and I taught you all of the family constellation names, though I really didn't give a shit about any of them. But you asked. He sighed in relief as Harry's grip on his wand loosened significantly, and he stepped forward, his hands coming to cup the boy's tan cheek, which was paler than he remembered. It was also the first time we kissed, he said low enough so only Harry would hear. You were frantic, scared of rejection, and constantly apologizing. He felt tears of his own well in his lower eye as he watched his Harry's own tears flow freely. And after some persuasion, I managed to get over my guilt and kissed you back like you deserved. Harry was sobbing openly now, and he flung himself at Sirius. His Sirius, he thought. Sirius caught him around the waist and hugged him tightly. Never again will I leave you, he thought. Harry's nose was buried in Sirius's hair, rolling in the scent of his favourite storm that had disappeared for months. Sirius, he choked, and his arms tightened around said man's neck, cradling his face and digging his fingers into his hair. He leaned back and looked into Sirius's grey eyes. Sirius, he murmured in reverence, stroking Sirius' cheek tenderly, and he thanked whichever god that gave him such a perfect person to be all his. Harry, Sirius said in equal reverence, one hand buried in the short man's wild hair, stroking it repeatedly, as if to confirm to himself that he was really here. They both smiled, and Harry sobbed once more, this time in happiness, before he dove in and connected his lips with Sirius. He ignored the multiple gasps in favour of winding his hands through Sirius's hair and latching on for dear life. Sirius licked his bottom lip, and he opened eagerly to taste that flavour he had missed with his life. He moaned when Sirius's tongue slid over his, leaving a trail of fire whiskey and cigarette smoke behind. He jumped, wrapping his legs around Sirius and pulling him closer, trying to dig enough to taste the peach. Sirius's hands automatically came to his waist, hugging him so he wouldn't fall, and he felt one hand wander up the back of his shirt, while the other fell to his arse. He wondered faintly if they ever really needed to come back up for air. He whined as he got his answer, and Sirius pulled his mouth from his. He gasped, panting for breath before the sense of guilt hit him again. I'm sorry, he sobbed, still holding on for dear life, not wanting to let go, even though he knew he should. Sirius rubbed his back with the hand that was under his shirt, shushing at him to try and quell his worries. I'm sorry. I caused you to spend months in that place, he choked out. I'm sorry I killed you, even though it was only temporary. Sirius dropped him to his feet and covered his lips with his once again to get him to shut up. It wasn't your fault, he whispered. It was mine. I left the house when I was told not to. He looked at Dumbledore, who was standing like the rest of the Order, except for Hermione and Remus. with his eyes wide and curses on the tip of his tongue, and made a gesture that said sorry. Harry looked up at him, and he placed his hands on the boy's cheek, running his thumb over the dark circles. "I'm sorry." Harry's expression quickly turned to rage, and he wiggled out of the man's embrace, shoving his fists against his chest repeatedly in between words. "How dare you leave me?" he shouted. "Do you know how miserable I was? Don't even Don't you ever think about leaving this goddamn house again, because if you do—" He left the threat empty and turned his back to Sirius. "The only reason," he looked over his shoulder at the man, "you're not sleeping on the couch tonight is because I missed you and your annoying ass." He huffed and walked back up the stairs, intending to eat his soup and then sleep. An awkward, angry silence filled the dining room. "So," he said hesitantly, "how about dinner?" Hermione rose from her seat and strode towards Sirius determined. She clenched her fist and brought it back, landing directly on his cheek. She rubbed her knuckle because son of a deranged Merlin that hurt. She was satisfied when he began rubbing his face. "That was for leaving Harry," she said, and then looked down guiltily now that her anger had passed. "Even though you didn't have a choice," she muttered, and raised a hand when Sirius began to talk. "Just don't do it again," she demanded, and sat back down next to Remus, placing her napkin in her lap and picking up her fork to eat her meal. The rest of the people in the room, who had looked at her approvingly when she had punched him, were now looking at her as if she were crazy as she ignored the glaring red flag that Sirius and Harry had kissed. She looked up, her eyes darting between each member as she swallowed her pasta. "What?" she asked. "Why are you looking at me like that? Is it because I didn't punch him for kissing Harry? If so, you need to get your eyes checked, because they've been pretty obvious, and I can't say that a blind and deaf person wouldn't be able to notice just how in love they are." She huffed, pushing her chair back and standing up. "And don't you dare try and take away the first bit of happiness Harry has had since the end of last year. Hell, since 1981, if I do say so myself," she said, pushing her glare to its limits and making sure her words sunk in. She scrambled up the stairs, intent on checking on Harry before she went to bed herself. She smiled when she opened the door and was greeted by a half-full bowl of soup and a sleeping Harry. She stayed there for a moment, basking in her best friend's joy that showed clear as day on his face, even in sleep, before slowly backing away and closing the door quietly, almost screaming when she saw someone in the shadows. A finger pressed to her lips as Sirius came into view. "Thank you," he said, and she cocked a brow, asking him to explain more. "Thank you for trying to get him to be himself again. Remus told me what he was like, and I hope you know that if it was my choice, I'd never leave him, ever." Hermione smiled at him, though she couldn't help but feel the slightest bit jealous. Harry had gotten his love back after all, but she knew he deserved Sirius more than anything, and though nothing could bring Cedric back, she had already grieved, and she was more than happy that her friend was starting to get the life he deserved. Hermione shook her head. "No, thank you. Thank you for making him happy, for giving him a reason not to play hero," she said, and with a light touch to his shoulder, she was gone. Sirius sighed. He was very thankful for Hermione, and all she had done for Harry. Sirius placed his hands on the door and pushed it open gently. He smiled at Harry's utterly peaceful form, and walked to the bedside quietly. He vanished the tray of food to the kitchen, and cast a few cleaning spells over himself, Harry, and the bed, because by the looks of it, neither of them had showered for days, and they didn't have the energy to either. He then climbed in beside Harry as quietly as possible, intending not to wake him. But it was inevitable. Harry was a light sleeper after all. Sirius sighed dejected as Harry's eyes opened. Harry needed sleep, and he was simply getting in the way. "Thank you," Harry murmured, cuddling up next to Sirius with his head on Sirius's chest. "For what?" he asked, waving a hand through Harry's hair to massage his scalp gently. Harry sighed in pleasure at the feeling of Sirius's hands on him after so long, not to mention Sirius gave the best massages. "For the spells?" Harry paused, and after a few moments of comfortable silence, he spoke once more. "And for coming home? And don't," he said, shoving a finger against Sirius' lips, even with his eyes closed, as he knew Sirius was going to try and speak. "And don't think you're bothering me," he said, his Viridian eyes opening to look at Sirius's pale ones. "Don't think you're getting in the way. You are my other half, Sirius," he said, halfway sitting up and burying his face into Sirius's curls, inhaling his favourite scent of rain and wind. "You are my home." He placed his hand upon Sirius's cheek, caressing his newly forming black eye gently, and with a smile he kissed Sirius tenderly, his lips brushing against the soft rosy skin offered to him. Sirius's lips were like leather, smooth and soft, yet deadly all the same, and Harry was addicted. He brushed his tongue alongside Sirius's bottom lip, tasting Sirius, and sighed, slowly pulling back but keeping Sirius close all the same. "I'm glad you're home," he said, and Sirius wrapped his arms around Harry, dragging him into a tight embrace before kissing his forehead and flicking his wrist to turn off the lights. "I love you, Harry," he said, but it went unheard because Harry was already asleep, safe and within reach. They would never be apart again, he vowed to himself, because after all, what was a hurricane without his eye?